Why do intelligent, capable, emotionally aware people slowly lose their mental strength without ever realizing when it began? Why do you sometimes feel drained, anxious, or hollow even though nothing is technically wrong with your life? And what if the real danger to your mind isn't trauma, failure, or hardship, but the invisible psychological places you inhabit every day? In the final years of his clinical practice, Carl Jung made a disturbing observation. Patients did not break down because they were weak. They broke down because they lived too long inside certain psychological environments that quietly restructured how their minds worked. These were not physical locations. They were mental spaces created by relationships, social systems, habits of thought, and unexamined emotional contracts. Jung noticed that once a person spent enough time in these environments, their inner strength began to erode not suddenly, but gradually, subtly, almost invisibly. In 1961, a man came to Jung who appeared, on the surface, entirely functional. He held a respected job, he was socially active, he was articulate, polite, and intellectually sharp. There were no obvious signs of mental illness. Yet something was wrong. He reported constant exhaustion, growing anxiety, emotional numbness, and an unsettling feeling that his life no longer belonged to him. He said, "I feel like my mind is turning against me, but I don't know why." Jung did not begin by analyzing the man's childhood or diagnosing pathology. Instead, he asked a different question: where does your mind spend most of its time? What Jung uncovered was not a single trauma, but a network of psychological environments that were slowly dismantling the man's inner stability. The first was what Jung later described as a collective echo-spacer mental environment, where the same ideas, beliefs, fears, and judgments were endlessly reflected back until they felt unquestionable. The man spent hours each day among people who thought exactly as he did, feared the same social changes, and reinforced the same resentments. He believed this made him informed and secure. In reality, it was shrinking his capacity for independent thought. Jung observed that when a mind is never challenged, it becomes fragile. Certainty replaces curiosity, belonging replaces truth. Questioning begins to feel like betrayal. The man no longer evaluated ideas based on evidence or reflection, but on whether they aligned with the group. His sense of identity fused with collective opinion. Jung called this state collective possession, the moment when the group begins thinking through the individual rather than the individual thinking for himself. The man's anxiety intensified whenever he encountered opposing views, not because those views were wrong, but because they threatened the psychological safety provided by sameness. Jung recognized this as a warning sign. When disagreement feels dangerous, the mind is no longer free. Once weakened by this environment, the man became vulnerable to a second psychological place, one even more corrosive. His sense of self-worth began to depend on constant comparison. He measured his value against colleagues, friends, and acquaintances. Every success felt hollow because someone else had achieved more. Every failure felt catastrophic because it confirmed his fears of inadequacy. Jung noted that comparison does not motivate growth. It trains the mind to search endlessly for deficiency. The man described moments that should have brought pride, a promotion, public recognition, financial stability, but none of them lasted. The moment he achieved something, his mind immediately scanned for someone ahead of him. His happiness depended not on fulfillment, but on relative position. Jung understood this as a psychological trap where the self no longer exists as an inner reality, but as a ranking. This environment severed the man from his own values. He no longer pursued what felt meaningful. He pursued what looked impressive. His life became an image rather than an experience. Jung warned that when a person lives this way long enough, they lose contact with their inner compass. Decisions become reactive. Desire becomes borrowed. The self dissolves into metrics. But the most damaging effect of these first two environments was what they made possible next. The man entered a psychological space where authenticity became dangerous. His workplace rewarded performance, not truth. Agreement was safer than honesty. Confidence mattered more than sincerity. Over time, he learned to hide uncertainty, suppress disagreement, and present a carefully curated version of himself that aligned with expectations. Jung described this as total identification with the persona, the social mask. At first the mask felt protective. It brought approval, stability, and advancement. But gradually, it became suffocating. The man no longer knew where the mask ended and he began. He felt exhausted after every interaction. He felt anxious before meetings, not because of the work, but because he feared slipping out of character. Jung recognized this as a critical danger. When the mask becomes the identity, the real self begins to disappear. Each small compromise felt insignificant. laughing at something he found troubling, agreeing with ideas he opposed, staying silent when something felt wrong. But over time, these compromises accumulated into self-betrayal. The man told Jung, "I don't know who I am anymore. I only know how to perform." Jung understood that once a person abandons authenticity for long enough, they enter another psychological environment without realizing it, one where emotional needs are buried under the illusion of harmony. The man came from a family that prided itself on peace. They never argued. They never expressed anger. They never spoke openly about pain. Needs were considered selfish. Vulnerability was considered weakness. On the surface, it looked stable. Psychologically, it was starvation. The man learned early that emotional expression disrupted the system. So he learned to silence himself. His anxiety and emptiness were not random. They were the cost of living in a place where honesty was forbidden. Jung observed that emotional suppression does not eliminate feeling. It drives it underground, where it manifests as tension, depression, and chronic unease. What made this place especially dangerous was how normal it felt. The man believed this was what maturity looked like. He believed that endurance equaled strength. Jung saw the truth. Peace without honesty is not peace. It is paralysis. By the time the man reached this point, his mind was already under severe strain, but the most destructive environments were still ahead. As Jung continued working with the patient, he noticed another pattern that explained why recovery felt so difficult. The man was rarely alone with his thoughts. Silence unsettled him. Stillness made him anxious. Every quiet moment was filled with newspapers, radio programs, conversations, and constant activity. His mind existed in a state of perpetual stimulation. Jung recognized this as a psychological environment where noise replaces reflection and distraction replaces integration. The man believed he was staying engaged with the world. Jung saw something else entirely. He saw avoidance. Beneath the noise lived unresolved grief, unmade decisions, and unacknowledged fear. The constant stimulation prevented these elements from surfacing, but it also prevented clarity. The man consumed enormous amounts of information, yet felt increasingly confused. His thoughts became fragmented, his attention scattered. His inner voice grew faint. Jung warned that when the mind never rests, it loses the ability to synthesize experience into wisdom. Information accumulates without meaning. Opinions form without depth. The individual becomes reactive rather than reflective. Over time, chaos becomes addictive. The nervous system adapts to stimulation and begins to fear quiet. Stillness feels dangerous because it invites confrontation with the self. This environment made the man vulnerable to one of the most insidious psychological places. Jung identified a space where the individual systematically abandons himself. The man said yes when he wanted to say no. He stayed in draining relationships because leaving felt disruptive. He chose what was expected rather than what felt true. Each decision seemed practical. Taken together, they erased him. Jung described this state as psychological self-abandonment. Not a single act, but a pattern. The body sends signals: fatigue, resistance, discomfort, but they are ignored. Over time, those signals weaken. The individual loses access to intuition. Life is lived from obligation rather than desire. The man told Jung, "I don't even know what I want anymore. I just do what needs to be done." This place is especially dangerous because society rewards it. Responsibility, reliability, self-sacrifice. From the outside, the person looks mature. Inside, they feel empty. Jung understood that when a person lives this way long enough, a profound hollowness emerges, not sadness, but absence. And finally, Jung led the man into the most dangerous place of all, the one that exists entirely within the psyche. A space where everything rejected, denied, or feared is stored. Jung called it the shadow. The man had spent years avoiding parts of himself he considered unacceptable: anger, envy, vulnerability, grief. Each time these surfaced, he pushed them down. But Jung knew what modern psychology would later confirm: what is suppressed does not disappear, it accumulates, it gains autonomy, it begins influencing behavior from the unconscious. The man found himself overreacting, sabotaging relationships, repeating patterns he consciously rejected. He felt as though something inside him was working against him. This was not fate, it was unintegrated shadow. Jung explained that the shadow is dangerous only when ignored. Within it lives not just destructive impulses, but vitality, creativity, and strength. The man's suppressed anger, once acknowledged, revealed clear boundaries. His buried sadness revealed empathy. His denied resentment revealed truths he had never allowed himself to see. Integration was not comfortable. It required honesty without judgment, curiosity without shame. But as the man faced what he had buried, his anxiety began to loosen. His reactions softened, his sense of self strengthened. Jung guided him through a process of conscious recognition, identifying which environments he inhabited daily, limiting exposure to spaces that weakened him, creating room for silence, practicing authenticity even when it felt risky, reconnecting with his own values, and most importantly, developing a relationship with his shadow rather than fleeing from it. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The man reported feeling mentally clearer than he had in decades. Decisions felt simpler. Relationships became fewer but deeper. His mind no longer felt hostile. Jung called this psychological sovereignty, the ability to inhabit one's own mind without fear. Jung observed something else as the man changed. His environment responded. Family members resisted at first. His refusal to participate in silence disrupted the system, but over time, honesty spread. At work, some colleagues withdrew, but others leaned in. Authenticity proved contagious. Jung believed this was the ultimate insight. These dangerous psychological places persist because we collectively agree to inhabit them. When one person leaves, the structure weakens. When enough people leave, it dissolves. The 7 places Jung identified were never meant to imprison the mind. They are defaulties: familiar, seductive, belonging without thinking, measuring without meaning, performing without being, enduring without feeling, consuming without reflecting, giving without honoring oneself, avoiding without integrating. Mental strength is not built by avoiding difficulty. It is built by choosing which difficulties are worth facing. The question is not whether you will encounter these psychological environments you already have. The question is whether you will recognize them before they hollow you out, whether you will have the courage to leave what is familiar but destructive, and whether you will create spaces within yourself and around you where the mind can grow rather than shrink. Your mind is not your enemy, but the places you allow it to inhabit might be. The moment you recognize where you are, you begin the journey toward psychological freedom.